The horror genre is fascinated with the monster. The ghost, the serial killer, the creature that goes bump in the night. Often, we spend so much time talking about what we're running from, we pay little attention to what we're running through. The setting of a horror story can tell us just as much about what we are afraid of as the creatures within it. An ancient graveyard, a haunted house, or a frozen wasteland.
Though the winter months may be viewed as cozy, remembered by the warm nights by the fire and sips of hot cocoa while the snow falls gently outside, this comfort only exists in contrast to what is often the most inhospitable time of the year, if not for the carefully constructed four walls most of us live within. So it's no wonder many of horror's most iconic stories have been told within these frigid environments.
For horror games, though, I found it to be an especially underutilized setting, most often employed in the tradition of holiday horror oddity, more preoccupied with the novelty of a murderous Santa Claus. But there are, of course, games which make great use of these settings. So what I'd like to do today is go over some smaller horror titles which truly understand the potential of this environment. From lost Arctic expeditions which descend into delirium and eldritch horror, to tooth and nail fights for survival in post-apocalyptic winters, to hair-raising folkloric tales which lift the veil between the game world and the player.
We're going to talk about all of that and more, but first, we're losing daylight. I gotta head out now if I want to reach shelter.
We saw it come out from the cold, origin unknown. It landed here not long ago, and we saw the ash and snow. And something's interlaced, celestial DNA. Can't trust a single soul, so we'll die out in this cold.
The wintry months often bring with them a sense of bleak isolation. Days run short, nights run cold. The freezing temperatures and snowed-in roads mean we spend much of this season inside by ourselves. And this isolated, gloomy setting is exactly when and where the game Truss takes place. Created by Ampuco for the haunted PS1 Madvent calendar in 2022, the game opens in a white void, faced with a cast iron fireplace and simple instructions. Pick up the vessel. We grab a log from beside it, give it your flame, place it in the throne. Suddenly, the warm scene of a log cabin materializes around us, the flame our lone source of light. A warm but dim flame burns quietly in my domicile, in a grand, joyous defiance of the elements just beyond these walls. We look outside the snow-covered windows. It's strange to find such serenity near the threat of the elements. Yet at the same time, there is an unmistakable allure to exit this safety and brave the cold, to be the only sentient being for dozens and dozens of miles, basking in the roaring silence of the harshest winter's night. The music here, and throughout the game, is absolutely beautiful and sets the atmosphere perfectly, which is, for now, comfortable. Giving into the allure of the winter night, we open the door and find ourselves surrounded by a dark forest, snow blanketing the ground and the tops of the trees. The peaceful music fades as we're given one final hint. Shift to run. Never a good sign when a horror game gives you that information. Lit by a single lamppost, a note nearby reads, "Tonight, all your demons will join you." Then a sound. I think I just heard something by the nature trail sign. I'm going to try to avoid explaining every single detail within the game, because I think it would be kind of lame, and I also want you to be able to have a unique experience playing the game for yourself. But it is a pretty densely packed experience, especially when it comes to the information necessary to my analysis later on. Even this early on, the game has captured very well the contrast of this wintry setting, the comfort and warmth inside our cabin, and the almost immediate unease when braving the frozen winter night. Following the sound, we begin to hear another set of footsteps than our own. And then we see them, a series of footprints wandering deeper into the woods, the one leaving them behind invisible to us. As we wander, the looming shapes of transmission towers and the tendrils of their power lines emerge from the darkness, and just as suddenly as they appeared, the footsteps end at a sign. Have you lost yourself? Hold R to wake up. Our eyes close, and we awaken back in our cabin. The flame continues burning. Strangely, I can't help but feel it's judging me. This is when it becomes apparent that our reality in this cabin is not entirely what it seems. Though our first hint was probably its sudden appearance from the void. Was it a nightmare? Was I just asleep? I could stay here with the fire, but I won't get any answers. In search of these answers, we brave the cold yet again. From here, we follow a series of lamps, each emitting its own dreamy synth chord, which when strung together, form the soundtrack to our exploration of the night. This is such a clever idea, and it is wonderfully executed. I am absolutely in love with it. Further out into the cold, a portal opens to us, leading us into a darkened void. Visually, this is one of the coolest sequences in any of the games we'll be talking about. The wireframe hallway unfurling before us in multicolored strands. It's here where we discover three symbols: the king, the monarchy, the damned, which combine to create the dream, which appears to be our world. Back to the fireplace, the flame is even stronger now. When we brave the cold of the outdoors again, we're met with a vision. A distorted figure speaks to us. We can't stay here forever. Our flame needs to breathe. When we awaken from this vision, we see just how right they were. The flame has burned too hot, and our cabin disintegrates to embers around us, revealing another distorted figure looming above. It leads us further into the darkness, trailing footprints just like before. This is what was leading us at the very start. But yet again, we can't trust our senses as we awaken back inside our cabin, except this time, it's dark and dull. Our flame has disappeared. Outside, the trees are gone, and instead a massive ceiling of snow slowly descends around us as we push further and further into the darkness, and more tangled strings begin spelling out a message in front of us. Just as the incoming pressure of the snow starts to feel too much, we can read it. I cannot feel anything. It hurts. But we awaken again. And from here, in this darkness, missing our only lifeline in the flame, our character begins piecing together what has been happening. This world is not what it seems. This world is one I've manufactured. No matter how stubborn I am, how much I want to live this life, I cannot feel anything from it. I cannot cope. And finally entering back into the cabin, we come face to face with the demons that have been haunting us and leading us around in the dark. It's me. And with this realization, it seems something starts to heal. I could feel something. Inside the cabin, the fire is burning again. My flame never did leave me. Then it fades. An engine sits idle, its flame taken, yet the world the two produced persists indefinitely, a creation separated from its creator, awaiting others to give it new purpose. What follows this is a conversation seemingly with themselves. I really thought I needed this, that I needed to escape. Everyone I've ever known and created always seems so fulfilled, living their own stories. I always assumed that I would start my own story as soon as I satisfied my flame. Yet after an eternity of creating, I realized that day may never come. I left all my memories behind and assumed my artificial role. I told myself I've always been here, and that my demons were never a part of me. I think I did that because I believed my eternal pursuit of art was a curse, that I would never get to escape it and finally have my own story. But I realized that an eternal life of passions and the endless pursuit of art is still a story worth having. I should have never blamed the flame. It's always been my seed of purpose, and even if I'll never satisfy it, it makes me happy to try. I hope to meet you again someday, and we'll share what we both made. Until then, I'm ready to wake up now. Awakening a final time, the game, this artificial world, closes. Truss is a game about a lot more than just the winter. It is clearly a very personal story, more of a character study than a straight horror scarefest about a monster in the woods or freezing to death. But its setting of an isolated cabin in a snowy forest, I think, is pretty integral to its themes, and actually holds a lot more significance than it might initially appear. But first, let's talk about the first layer. From the very beginning, we understand that in some way, the world of Truss is not a stable reality, and it seems to insist over and over that this is some kind of dream. But it's not a literal dream. Instead, as the character seems to describe, it's sort of an artificial refuge for a character filled with inner turmoil, and each element of it represents something specific. The flame, in a fairly recognizable metaphor, is our character's creative drive, their passion. In the cabin, they hole up, avoiding the outside world and instead focusing entirely on feeding this burning flame. The woods outside, by contrast, means confronting the demons, the things ultimately still personal and a part of us, but more difficult to face. Depression and a larger sense of unfulfillment, the things that led to this turning inward in the first place. Diving entirely into the work, creating the art, and finally finishing this project allows them to escape their problems for a little longer. However, these demons have a way of creeping up on us at times, pulling us out for a little while. But the part of us that just wants to work and finish this damn thing doesn't always approve of taking the time away for self-reflection, a term which takes literal meaning later in the game. This lifestyle of only ever working and beating yourself up for never finishing it is ultimately unsustainable. Eventually, this character burns out, and their one shelter from these demons seemingly disappears. Enveloped by all the issues they seem to have had before, the depression, the fear, the unfulfillment, they spiral. But in a way, this may be a blessing in disguise. Finally immersed in their issues, they're forced to actually face them. We can get a pretty decent idea of what some of these issues are. Depression seems to be the most obvious, from messages like, "I can't feel anything," and their sense that everyone else seems to have these rich stories which they cannot feel for themselves. Though this depression may have been pre-existing, it's also not uncommon for this kind of burnout to actually cause this depression, as I'm sure many other artists can relate to, and it's something that hits especially close to home for me over these past couple of years. Though the flame appears at first to have died out, it was never really gone. Without the proper balance, it can be incredibly difficult to access that passion again, but if you can regain that balance, you'll find the fire never really left. The final, all too common issue this story seems to focus on is the need to finish things. It's something I discussed a bit in my Basilisk 2000 video. There is an unavoidable allure to perfecting and finishing everything you create. Of course there is. You're making it because you'd like to see what it becomes. But this chasing of perfection and completeness can lead to many more issues: scope creep, procrastination, constant adjustments, and burnout. Paradoxically, this need for a project to be complete can be the largest obstacle in it ever being finished. When the character finally lets go of their creation, allows it to be seen by others even if it isn't perfect, they are able to move on. What the finale of Truss recognizes is that the process of creating is not an obstacle to overcome, but in the end, the very thing that makes it worth creating in the first place. It's also worth noting the interesting way it explores these relationships through its royal trinity in the Dark Void: the king, the monarchy, the damned. With the fireplace being referred to as the throne, it follows that the vessel is the king, that which fuels the passion. Maybe then the damned is the project itself in a finished state, something which the character feels may never come, and the monarchy, the creative process by which all of this is being conceived. I'm not 100% sure I've got that part down, to be honest, but I think it's worth looking into. I guess I should say all of this analysis has been my interpretation of what is, again, a seemingly very personal story, so I wouldn't take anything I've said as gospel. I highly, highly recommend you play this for yourself because I've only really highlighted here what I think was important for my analysis, and I never want these videos to be a replacement for experiencing it for yourself. Go on, play it. It takes like less than 30 minutes, it's name your price on itch.io, and it's one of the most unique games to come out of the haunted PS1 demo disc.
In all the ways that Truss uses its environment as a metaphor for its internal examinations, its observations are also true in the opposite direction. Our constructed shelters are often our only protections in these unlivable environments, and though we may get accustomed to them, their protections are much more fragile than we might like to think. A power outage or broken window away from the freezing temperatures and hostile winds of the outside world. We only survive as long as nature allows it. But it's in human nature to explore and settle in the face of this. The unmistakable allure to exit this safety and brave the cold, to be the only sentient being for dozens and dozens of miles, basking in the roaring silence of the harshest winter's night. It's this allure which motivates us to the summit of Everest or into Arctic expeditions. In most places, the snow eventually melts. The freezing temperatures give way to more hospitable conditions, the environment returning to life in the spring. Most places, anyway. In the Arctic, there is rarely such reprieve. But something still seems to pull us to explore, to conquer these climates, in the places where the snow doesn't melt. That which gave chase is described as a first-person dog-sledding thriller, and that is a perfectly apt description. The game begins on a dark night in the Arctic. The silhouette of a man stands beside our dog sled, waiting expectantly.
We should keep moving.
Mounting our sled, we head off, together with this mysterious man. The story of this game is not told in a linear fashion, instead jumping between various points in time throughout our journey. For now, we know very little, other than that this man has hired us, a musher, to take him through the Arctic terrain on some as of yet unspecified mission.
I think much will come of this. It is time for me to return, to finish the work I've started.
He smiles, but his expression is far from reassuring. It's quite unsettling, to be honest. Our journey through this Arctic environment leads us through a lot of this steep, rolling terrain, and it takes special care to keep our sled from tipping over. That wiped the creepy smile off your face. Through the icy haze, a cabin emerges in the distance, where we're supposed to meet with the others. That is, if they're still there. It seems our mission is to reunite this man with the rest of his group, but before we can see inside, we cut through time again. It's the middle of the night, and our sled dogs are nowhere to be found. Instead, we follow the sole light of our companion's lantern through the frozen hills.
Not much further,
He says,
Remember, this is just the first step. All your efforts up to this point will be matched, twofold, or worse.
Much of his dialogue is like this, vaguely ominous and difficult to parse exactly what it means. Strange guy. With another jump, we're taken back to our sled dogs and the daylight. Not far off, a caribou stands, and the strange man hands us a rifle. Felling it, we approach its body, the man drinking from an unmarked flask as we do so, and he collects a mushroom that the caribou seem to be eating.
Almost ruined. Their behavior remains strange to me, though I understand it much better now.
We're surrounded by barren trees. The sun has gone down. We hold our rifle in hand as the game reminds us, shift to run. Caribou fill the forest, intermittently charging us from the tree line. All around the snow-covered ground, mushrooms grow, which they seem intensely drawn to. Then, we stumble upon a figure hunched over a gravesite, and a signpost. The man explains that we use these as directional markers. The wind has clearly picked up and the visibility has lowered drastically, so these will be very useful.
You'll learn not to place much trust in your senses here, least of all your memory.
He takes another sip from his flask, and we head off once again, leaving the signpost behind. Cutting through more rough terrain as the wind picks up, we approach another cabin. It's dark. The cabin is empty. Still no sign of the others. We press on, through a canyon of ice and snow. The strange man regales us further.
Perhaps it was vain ambition that first led me to go further than any of my companions deemed responsible. That lies in the past. I know now what my purpose is. This place is the sieve. Pass through, and you shall find all your imagined woes have been left behind. But know this, the ghosts that give chase through the gray will never leave your side.
Then, we're sitting at a campfire with the strange man.
Do you wish to leave?
We're given a choice to respond.
I intend to stay. Have I told you what became of that deathless deer?
I think we're missing some context here due to the time jumps. So far, we haven't heard about any deathless deer.
My expedition was slipping through my fingers. We were being humiliated by the conditions, and all efforts to chart a course were fruitless. Yet somehow, these stupid creatures were able to not just survive, but thrive.
We fade, and then return to the sled. And for some reason, the man is gone. As we ride, the strange man continues his stories about the reindeer. As he does, we see them gathering, running ahead of us, like they're guiding us in the right direction, or we're chasing them.
We were eager to study these animals, to learn how they could thrive in such an unforgiving place. We withheld one from its herd. How did it know where to go? How did it chart its course? One said the animal could hear the faint beating of the hooves across the ice, so we cut off its ears. Another proposed it could see the slightest indentations in the snow, and we took out its eyes.
The animals ahead continue to gather.
Yet we emerged on the other side, and the creature was reunited with its herd, as if it knew things it could not have been taught, or used senses we could not take from it.
The more I learn about this guy, the less I like him. Continuing forward, we are now being pursued by a thundering stampede of caribou. The tables have turned. Maybe we deserve this. At least the strange man does for his insane experiments on them. Speeding through, we are forced to make razor-sharp turns as we find ourselves on a cliff's edge. The thundering sounds of hooves and tumbling snow mix together, and it is impossible to make out the difference in the cacophony. We thread the needle over a land bridge which crumbles behind us, saving us but dooming the deer.
Good riddance.
We continue forward, through to the next cabin. It's dark. The man is gone. We enter the cabin. Though there are no inhabitants, we are able to investigate what they left behind. Mushroom samples and writings.
I am not sure what purpose my writing could serve, but I still find value in it. Perhaps it is just for my own sanity. Writing helps me recall, helps me separate my own thoughts and memories from theirs. We have all settled into our roles rather well, albeit with one glaring exception. Misplaced among 5 hardened expeditionists stood I, a failed writer, along with 2 artists, and of course, the ill-fated young botanist, all hand-picked by our great leader, a man whose name once carried some renown in certain circles. In his eyes I saw that same light which shone so fiercely in the horizon, leading us to the first sight. I recall my heart sank, for I knew that that light would only ever lead us further into the gray.
The final page is blacked out with a large, fairly ominous circle. Another stray page reads,
One thing is certain. Here we are completely at the mercy of the conditions. All attempts at crossing this thick mist on our own have failed. With neither water, sky, or ice blink to guide us, we always end up right where we started. When the place chooses to give us directions, we have no choice but to follow.
Finally, a note on the door.
For the outsider, the one who is being led, we see you, too.
I can't help but think that's me. The strange man shoots down a charging caribou.
You better start paying attention. We are not safe here.
Let's get out of here then. Making our way to another signpost, the animals seem to become less and less friendly by the minute. Can't say I blame them.
Do not worry. Here we are all bound to its grip. My body unable to move, my memories no longer my own.
Just want you to stop saying odd shit.
So, we continue on. The woods are dark, no longer barren branches, but dense foliage, obscuring the path.
As long as I am needed, I am unable to leave.
We're sitting with him at a campfire again. He prepares us a drink from his flask.
Not unlike you, I am a victim of circumstance. Do not ask me to reason. The reasoning of your own mind may be as impenetrable to you as the reasoning of others.
He stands, a knife in his hand.
Now, just as I brought you here, you will bring me out.
We awaken in a cave, sitting on a chair, mushrooms stuffed into crude incisions made in our arms. Left with no other choice, we eat them. And the world shifts around us, our memories flashing. Nearby, we find notes left by the strange man.
Recall that on the outskirts of the borders of this place sits a small village, dug into the pines. In my memory, I spoke to a young man there, convinced him to abandon his life and live like I did. He should be close now. I guide him as well as I can, and hope you will do your part. You, who recalls everything, remember this also. I brought them here. I am the one who should be allowed to leave.
He's poisoned us and left us here, a sacrifice for his own escape to whatever deity he believes has kept him, perhaps whatever entity or force it is that guides the caribou, and which he seems to believe is guiding him too. We need to find our dogs and get out of here. Leaving the cave, we enter the final act. We follow the trail of our sled, littered with the bodies of caribou which the strange man has killed, either out of self-defense or maybe out of his startling disdain for them. We can only hope our dogs haven't met the same fate. In this weather, in the darkness, the trail is difficult to follow and we lose it quickly. However, eating the mushrooms gives us a little help. Whenever we consume them, our view flashes, first to visions of the expedition first arriving here, the strange man leading them, then into the recent past, allowing us to orient ourselves as we follow the direction he took our sled and dogs. Seeing how this works, it begins to give us an idea of what's going on here. These mushrooms have very clear psychedelic properties, distorting memories and a sense of self. At first, this seems like pure madness, delirium caused by these mushrooms and the environment, but there's something more going on here. These glimpses into the past, the ability to see things we never saw that are leading us accurately. Like there really is something more supernatural to it, some kind of arcane guidance in these mushrooms. We're led to the place where our sled crashed, our dogs nowhere to be seen, but we can hear them howling nearby. Following them, they lead us to another cabin. Inside, we find the bodies of the other expeditioners. They are in much the same state as we were, but they did not survive. The cabin is filled with writings and sketches of the mushrooms.
None of us are fully lost. We are still here, content with reliving the past through its eyes. He wishes to bring it out, to let it do there what it has done here. I don't know whether to stop him or help him. Let him rot in his cave. I prepare for one final journey, and pray it leads me elsewhere, or nowhere at all, not here. Curious that the task of mapping this place befell the botanist, who prior to this excursion had barely left the confines of his hometown. His drawings mean to resemble cartography. Surely whorls and tendrils are still on his mind. The borders swirl, stretching out across the impossible sea ice, connecting each grove in a wretched web. Every day he tries to perfect his distillations, hoping to be given insight into some great truth.
Though it is admittedly hard to parse out, the person writing these notes is clearly not the strange man, so I'll call him the author. Though initially it seemed to me that the strange man was actually the leader of the expedition, and I'm not fully convinced that isn't the case, these writings seem to suggest he may actually be the botanist. His mapping turning to visions of some great mycelial network which connects this entire Arctic plain, driven into madness in pursuit of its truth, and eventually seeming to betray everyone in an attempt to escape for himself, or maybe just following what he believes this eldritch network wants from him. At the very least, the author may have escaped, though in an environment like this, it's not likely he survived. As we continue searching for the rest of our dogs, a gunshot rings out. He's found us. With bullets whizzing by our head, we collect the last of the dogs and set out on our sled again, following the caribou, hoping they'll lead us somewhere, anywhere but here. And so it comes to the final showdown. We alternate between taking shots at him before he can successfully rush us in the fog, and trying to discern which of our hallucinations is the real him, before he can fire. It is a heart-pounding sequence underscored with a thrilling soundtrack, a perfectly executed climax to the building tension throughout the entire game. And then, once round after round has been emptied, the strange man falls. And from his body, we retrieve his flask. We press on again, the strange man's corpse seated where he's been throughout this entire journey, and we keep going and going until the sun goes down, further and further, into the snow. That which gave chase appears at first to be a complex and confusing story, with its nonlinear narrative, cryptic dialogue, our unreliable perspectives as both characters are plastered on hallucinogenic mushrooms. But what reveals itself from this at first opaque story is actually fairly straightforward. Every event doesn't need to be in perfect chronological order for us to parse out the narrative, and I think it's told in this Jeremy Bearimy sort of way because it's how the game can best introduce each story beat to maximize tension and make certain connections, ironically, easier to understand. We should go over a basic rundown of the events of the story though, just so we're on the same page. We begin with the strange man. Now, I see almost everyone who discusses this game seems to come away with the idea that he is actually the botanist. I definitely see some of the things pointing to that, and it could be that I missed something in my playthrough and subsequent reviewing of my playthrough, but I came away at first also believing he could have been the leader of the expedition, the man of some renown. As we see, he's closer to middle age, is seen leading the group in our hallucinations, and seems to imply this is his expedition. So I'm genuinely interested to hear from some of you what pieces left in the game seem to confirm his identity as the botanist. In either case, it doesn't change much about the main events of the game. During the initial expedition, in the man's own words, they were humiliated by the conditions. Lost and underprepared, they obviously took notice of the caribou, which seemed to thrive in this environment. Aside from their torturous experiments on the animals, what they found seemed to have something to do with these mushrooms. The map the botanist was making seems to clearly be visions of the mycelial network, the entity that allows the caribou to navigate and eventually assists us as well. Seeing some kind of arcane wisdom or intelligence in them and acting as their only lifeline in this place, the explorers fall into a kind of mushroom-induced madness, searching for the answers they believe these organisms hold. And none more so than the strange man. His spiral into insanity leads him to arrive at one solution. He is being called by this entity to sacrifice the others in order to escape. And the final part of his plan needs him to swap someone out for himself, a body for a body. He hires a musher, us, from a nearby village, under the pretense that we're going to help him return to his peers and perhaps continue on the expedition. In reality, anyone who hasn't already escaped has been killed, and we are his final sacrifice. In exchange for our life, he hopes to be allowed to leave, using our sled and dogs to finally escape the Arctic wilds. And obviously, we end up clawing our way out of this plan, but it's unclear if we'll ever make it out of the Arctic ourselves. I have a feeling, though, we have a better shot than he did. And that's not just because we're less pumped full of hallucinogens. This takes me to the first element of this game's themes, which I find really fascinating. The strange man seems resentful and bitter about the caribou. It's more than just an indifference to their pain. He seems to possess a kind of hatred for them. a jealousy of their ability to thrive in this environment and utilize the mushrooms successfully. And because of this, he shows them no respect, tortures them for his experiments, and views them as a mere obstacle, despite being the very thing that led them to the mushrooms in the first place. This could characterize the strange man as a person without respect for his environment, a hostility towards the natural world, and a sense of hubris in his confidence at his ability to conquer or overcome it. In this hubris, he believes himself to have struck some kind of deal with the mushrooms, as if he could ever possibly understand or have some control over them. In addition, he's a self-admitted outsider to this place, on an expedition to research and understand it, but clearly woefully underprepared. Now, contrast that with us, the Musher. We come from a village nearby. Though most anyone would be an outsider to the barren lands we explore in the game, if anyone belonged there, it would be someone who grew up right beside it. In addition, we don't have that adversarial relationship with our animals. We work alongside our dogs. We have a close bond with them. They're loyal to us because we're loyal to them. And I think this connection is made pretty strongly within the game. The caribou and the sled dogs both act as animals which are used as guides to our characters through the environment, but the regard and dignity our characters treat them with is what changes. And this connection is explored visually too, during the sequence in which we first follow the stampede of deer and are then chased by them. Though we don't know much about the Musher, these facts seem to paint a deep contrast between ourselves and the strange man. I don't think he ever really had a genuine connection to these mushrooms in the first place. A mix of his madness and vanity allowed him to believe he did. I think the game is trying to illustrate that our ability to survive is dependent on our relationship to nature. In the end, the individual who respects and works alongside it survives over those with contempt and dreams to conquer it. And this leads us to the core component which we'll be discussing throughout this entire video. That which gave chase gives us the danger of the environment in a very pure form. An environment where the deadliness of the cold never subsides, only gets worse in certain weather or times of year. It showcases the terror in being lost and unable to navigate and maintain your bearings, the madness which comes from isolation and being completely out of your element. Other animals who are suited to this weather survive and thrive, but we are not one of those animals. Sure, the strange man ends up being our ultimate threat, but the danger that looms over us the entire game, the very thing that leads the strange man to madness in the first place, the thing which by the end of the game we're unsure if we'll ever actually be able to escape from, is the world around us. The pure inhospitality. Despite our continuous march toward the research and tools which allow us to better navigate and survive in different environments as a species, it is hubris to think we've really overcome nature. There is no more primal threat, no more original feeling of horror than finding yourself alone in the hostile wild, lost and out of options. Your heart rate quickens as you realize you've gone in a circle, or have you? How can you tell any of this apart? How far are you from help? It could be a few hundred meters, it could be hundreds of miles, waiting for the hunger or wildlife or the cold to take you. Whichever comes first. Though we've talked a lot about the perils of the outdoors in winter weather, there's something to be said about the experience of being shut in during these months. What spending so much time inside in the dark, left to our own devices, can lead to. While there's comfort to be found in a night in with a warm drink, there's also a unique sense of melancholy after weeks spent indoors, sunlight ever fleeting. That experience is exactly what our next game taps into. Winter Walk 2006 begins with a CRT monitor. Turning it on, we're thrown into what is clearly a Windows XP throwback. Obviously, the game is evoking that 2006 era, snowed-in days home from school on the family computer. I really like how interactable the monitor is as well. You can mess with the brightness and volume using the actual buttons, and that click?
Otherwise, there's only two icons on the screen, recycling and a program titled Winter Walk 2006. Inside the recycling bin, we find two 3D renders reminiscent of the 90s and early 2000s. Without much else to do, we open Winter Walk, which boots to the OP Shocktide player, clearly a reference to the Adobe Shockwave player, ever so popular for web multimedia in the 2000s. The game itself, besides the strange Santa clip art, has nothing to do with Christmas. Instead, we wander a simple 3D world set to a melancholy soundtrack. We're in a snowy graveyard surrounded by woods, each grave marked with the phrase Memento Mori, remember you must die. The rendering of this environment is very reminiscent of early 3D web games, and the atmosphere that's being built here works especially well for me, because my childhood was filled with days spent sifting through obscure media on a Windows XP PC. I'm actually in the process of recreating my childhood Windows XP setup, and I'm using it to do little retro reviews over on my Patreon if you want to check that out. Just across the river, over this small wooden bridge, we find a lone gravestone and a key. Picking up said key, we hear a gate somewhere unlock. We're set out on the path deeper into the forest. The artificial walls of the tree line give this whole walk a claustrophobic, almost hedge maze feel, but eventually we come out on the other side into a clearing. Giving the environment a closer look around, you'll notice a shape in the snow. Approaching, we find that it's the body of a reindeer. It speaks to us. I'll be seeing you in your dreams. We cross the fallen log to the other side of the river, where a green arrow tells us to lie down for a while, a request which feels macabre in the face of what we just saw. Following the arrow's instructions, we look up at the winter sky, joining the deer as we lay in the snow. Suddenly, a voice from outside the room calls to us.
Hey kid, get to sleep soon, you gotta get up early tomorrow.
Time for bed. Suddenly, we're thrown to a new full-screen loading page, similar to the Shocktide screen we saw previously, seemingly implying we're loading into our sleep. Within this dream, we continue playing the game, though it's probably more accurate to say we're living the game. The sky is darker, and though everything appears at first to be mostly the same, we find cracks in this dreamed reality. Some of the gravestones repeat and warp, descending into the river or bending into the sky. We pick up the key again and repeat the process, back out into the clearing. The trees float in the air, as do the rocks. The deer's body is still there, but this time it's joined with the spectral image of its ghost hovering above. Welcome to me. In your dream, light a building on fire. The game dream means nothing. Please forget about it immediately. Alright then. We once again find ourselves faced with a green arrow and lie down in the snow. Darkness. The muffled sounds of a Christmas carol plays as our only option is forward, slowly revealing our character's body. There's a massive cavity in our chest, and we slowly descend further and further into it until the game closes. Winter Walk 2006 is definitely the most surreal game we'll be talking about today, and that's saying something after that which gave chase. It is much less preoccupied with telling a straightforward story that you can pick apart than it is with trying to recreate a very certain feeling. I think much of the really bizarre events, like the deer ghost's dialogue, can be chalked up to this pursuit of a dreamlike experience. So from an analysis perspective, I want to just go over some of the experiences and feelings that this evoked for me, and then how those might relate to our overarching themes of winter horror. What stuck out to me immediately was the imagery of the dead deer. There's something hard to place but very specific about the visual of a dead, wild animal, which is so evocative of many of our earliest experiences coming to terms with mortality, the kinds of things which do stick with us into our dreams as kids. This could be real experiences like seeing roadkill or going hunting for the first time, but for me, it drew my mind to one of my childhood favorite films, The Iron Giant. Specifically when the giant finds the body of a deer which two hunters have recently killed. It's the giant's first experience with mortality, but as a kid, it may have been one of the first times I ever considered such a thing as well. Maybe the reason it's so evocative is because animals don't distance themselves from the nature of death,
aren't turned to ash or filled with formaldehyde and placed in symbolically meaningful containers. They die, and their bodies just stay there, a lifeless biologic. And I think for many, encountering this can confront us with what death actually is, and that we're not so disconnected from the nature of other animals as we'd like to think. We're not invincible or above it all. Remember, you must die. Winterwalk 2006 views this realization through the lens of a childhood experience playing some obscure web game. And while these kinds of experiences can be important to our personal development as kids, it also brings to mind some less constructive experiences with sifting through internet media as a child. Internet trauma is, I think, a fairly ubiquitous experience for people of a certain age, but one that seems to fly under the radar for the most part. I'm sure children of the generation younger than me will have a lot of these experiences as well, in new and horrifying ways with our current internet, but people growing up on the internet in the 90s and 2000s will almost all have some internet memory that scared or scarred them in various ways, even those who were especially safe or strictly monitored by their parents. Sometimes these can be fairly harmless, in the vein of screamer faces and spooky movie clips. Other times, they can be from much more real and disturbing origins. In either case, they can stick with you in a way that you can't always explain. It's not always clear why one thing seems to stick in your mind when you close your eyes, or why it places a certain pit in your stomach whenever you see or think about it. And here's where I think both of these understandings of the game kind of loop around back to our main point about the hostility of wintry environments and the contrast between the cozy and inhospitable. The game takes special care to create this cozy snow day atmosphere, which is contrasted with the experiences of the unpredictable, harsh, and often hostile world of the internet, the traumatic wild west of cyberspace where we can run across all manner of distressing and disturbing things. Its vessel for this online experience is a macabre, icy world, a snow-capped graveyard in the forest. It's the same contrast of the comforts of the indoors and the perils of the outdoors, but this time that snowy environment is within the digital realm. And it uses this familiar unease with the harsh winter climate as a vehicle for a more ambiguous feeling, the cold and uncaring virtual world, where you may find death around any corner. And I think this also aligns well with our other point about a confrontation with mortality. Outside of the necessary shelter, it becomes clear how difficult and bleak survival actually is, how powerful the forces of nature really are, and how powerless we can be in the face of them. Winterwalk 2006 is the shortest game we're covering today, but that doesn't make it any less worth playing for yourself. The analysis or point-by-point walkthrough isn't what makes this game worth playing, it's the feeling you experience while playing it. A feeling you can only truly understand, I think, if you actually sit and play it for yourself. I recommend some headphones, really immerse yourself in it, and see what memories or feelings it conjures up. As many true stories there are of Arctic expeditions gone wrong, of fatal blizzards and frozen casualties, there are just as many, if not more, in the realm of myth. Folkloric tales of beasts emerging from the snow and urban legends of icy spirits and serial killers hunting drivers who've broken down in a snowstorm. Whether these tales are told to keep us away from the dangers of animals or crazed killers, or to anthropomorphize the hazards of nature itself, one thing they all have in common is that there's almost always something evil hiding in the snow. It's been a while since I've talked about an RPG Maker game, and I've definitely missed them. I don't feel so good today. Yesterday was quite messy. The wind blew away the bag of rubbish I was carrying. I should pick it all up. The clock ticks in a small bedroom, a checklist on the wall reading, "Collect more twigs." The house is eerily silent and fairly plain, unnoteworthy aside from one door which we cannot enter, only knock. Nobody answers. Bundling up for the outside weather, we head out into the snow. Our home is surrounded by dense woods, and our exploration is set to a peaceful melody. Nevertheless, something seems
off. We follow some scattered footprints through the woods, collecting twigs and various other items. Must be leftovers from our messy day yesterday. A red ribbon, a pair of boots, a doll. Along the way, we find these charming little snowmen dotted around the path. Just like everything else so far, though, something seems just a little off about them. Our first real sign of danger comes when we notice this log shed, where the snow is stained red with blood in a blotch outside.
Oh.
Entering the shed, we find it completely dark. A note inside reads, "Twigs, pebbles, snow. 3 left." Nearby, there's an old wood axe, which we pick up. But our suspicions of something sinister finally come to pass when we hear this horrifying sound. And are told quite directly to hide. We stumble through the dark until we find an open closet and duck inside. Something comes in, and then leaves. Braving the cold again, the sun is setting, and the music has changed ever so slightly. It's slower, darker. Using the axe to clear another path, we continue following these footprints in the snow, eventually stumbling upon a near incoherent note, the only clear text reading, "Sleep." Further into the woods, it's clear something is very wrong here. The mangled bodies of crows are strewn about the path, and even more splatters of blood, escalating until we find the smiling faces of the snowmen covered in it. Even stranger, when you step in one of these piles of blood, you seem to lose control over the character, as she will briefly take over and walk out of the pile. It's confusing at first because it's unclear if you just hit some of the wrong buttons or your inputs aren't working, but it seems to be the character acting of her own volition. Moving from one screen to another, our character suddenly speaks up. They're covered in blood. In a very jarring moment, they suddenly seem to remember something.
I know a shortcut back.
Then they race off screen, and we're left with nothing. We just sit and watch the eerie winter scene. Until we notice something. A small shadow was left behind, barely noticeable, but we can still control it. We follow it to the end of the screen and find our character waiting, and when we approach, we have control again. Very strange. We make our way back to the house. It's dark, and there are stains of blood on the floor. We wash off our blood-stained face and change back into our pajamas. We're left with no other option but to not sleep. The screen fades to black anyway. What was that? We awaken and investigate. In the living room, our closet has been forced open, tools scattered across the floor.
Tools for cutting and slicing.
Then, without a clear reason, the game asks us to save. Just like in Truss, there's a certain language to horror games which create tension without something explicitly happening in the game world, and instead within the mechanics and meta elements of the game. Asking to save suddenly is one of these things. The locked door next to our bedroom is still as closed as ever, so we head back to bed. And suddenly, the camera zooms in so we can only see a very small amount of the room. As we make our way to the bed, we begin to see something. A trail of blood leaves from the window through the room out the door, and suddenly, we're chased down an impossibly long hallway, barely escaping, and we need to find a way inside that door. The answers to the horrors we've witnessed, whatever it is that's been chasing us, have to lie there. Going to the bedside table,
It should be in here.
the key.
You know what to do.
Tentatively, we unlock the door, then enter.
Well, that's finally over. I have to say, you really helped me out there. I mean, the rubbish has been picked up, and this little rat that got away has been caught. Now, it's time to relax.
And she leaves. And we sit here, watching the carnage that we inadvertently helped facilitate, until we decide to close the game.
The twist of It Snowing is fairly apparent, and it isn't necessarily doing anything groundbreaking. But what I love so much about it is that it executes the twist so well, with so many unique concepts and approaches to building the kind of foreshadowing that brings the reveal at the end together. The dissonant notes in the music, the brief moments where we lose control of the character, the odd dialogue and jarring faces, especially the moment where our character suddenly remembers a shortcut and disappears. It's so sudden and unexpected, but perfectly communicates to the player that we're not really in control of the character, and that she's kind of a rogue entity. And even this moment is established so well because of the previous moments where she seems to briefly reorient herself. I again must ask you to play this game for yourself, and if seeing the twist here ruined it for you, might I suggest getting a friend to play it to see their reaction. This is the perfect kind of game for that, in my opinion, and like many of the games so far, it isn't very long. Anyway, it's this sort of non-control we have as the player that I think ties into the overarching themes we've been covering so far. One of the first things I thought after playing this game was how much it reminded me of a kind of folktale, stories of witches in the woods, like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre version of Hansel and Gretel. This at first seemingly innocent woman who lives isolated in a forest, revealed to be a villainous killer plucking unsuspecting victims who are unfortunate enough to wander into her woods. And this self-awareness she seems to have of the game and power over it stand in for the supernatural powers one might typically associate with a story like this. It's more than just a folkloric retelling, though. This character's ability to overpower the player's control, a kind of omniscience of even the game itself, an ability to see past the screen to the player, and some of the context around her victims has led me to interpret her as a kind of stand-in for the dangers of the harsh winter weather, a cruel personification of Mother Nature herself. Let's talk about her victims. As we wander the woods collecting the rubbish left behind by her victims, there's some things to note. It's not just ribbons or dolls, it's the very clothes off their backs, shoes, socks, hats, the very things that would otherwise be protecting them from the cold. And inside the locked room, we find them all also without these clothes. Why is this? The explanation that comes to mind for me is hypothermia. In the late stages of hypothermia, people become delirious and begin feeling very hot, despite still currently freezing to death. In turn, there are instances where this leads them to shed their warm clothes in an attempt to cool down. Additionally, the onset of tiredness and exhaustion is another common symptom, and it is advised to never let someone fall asleep who is experiencing hypothermia, as they may never wake up. A symptom that this note we find seems to allude to, seeing as this appears to be the fate of her victims, along with her isolation in these woods and apparent omniscience even through the fourth wall. I think there's a decent case to be made that she's a kind of folkloresque personification of the hostility and dangers of the harsh, freezing environment that is the winter, an environment that we sometimes foolishly believe we have more control over than we really do. She's a being in the woods which takes the inexperienced hiker, the lost traveler, the backpacker caught off guard, into the cold, when the temperatures drop below freezing, when the sun falls behind the horizon, when it's snowing. There's a lens with which we can analyze a lot of storytelling, based around the nature of its conflict, which are categorized in a few different ways. So far, we've covered a few games that fall quite neatly into one or even multiple of these. Truss could be seen as a man against self story, while we could see That Which Gave Chase as a man against man story. Of course, the threat of the environment has been present in some way throughout all of these, but when it comes to a pure man against nature experience, there is perhaps no better example than The Long Dark. I am not the most experienced player of The Long Dark. I only have a little over 35 hours in it, but there's something about it that sticks with me, and when going into this video, The Long Dark was the centerpiece in my mind. Now, there is a more narrative-driven way to play the game, Wintermute, but I'm going to focus on the survival mode for this video. The Long Dark is not explicitly a horror game. First and foremost, it is an unforgiving survival experience. Set in the wintry Canadian wilderness after a geomagnetic event cuts all power, the game is not about running from a monster or a crazed killer, it's about struggling to endure the elements for just a few moments longer. The Long Dark is detailed. You'll have to manage a lot more than just health and hunger. Temperature, hydration, encumbrance, exhaustion. Are your clothes wet? How well do they protect against the wind? What kind of medicine do you need? The game revels in the minutia of survival and requires the player to make tough decisions every second, and all of the investment it necessitates comes with real stakes. When you die, that is it. Your save is gone. Every decision, every detail matters. I've discussed the crossover of survival and horror games in the past. The tension created through survival mechanics lends itself really well to a horror atmosphere and creating naturally spooky moments. The Long Dark, I think, just does this particularly well, and all without zombies or monsters. Only the far more real threat of a chance encounter with a hungry bear or pack of wolves, and even then, you're far more likely to meet your fate in an unexpected snowstorm than with an animal. The horror of this game comes much more often from the very thing we've been discussing this entire video: the alienation from our environment, the clear fact that we do not belong here, the hostility not of a conscious being set out to destroy us, but the uncaring yet just as dynamic forces of nature. Seeing as the game is not a straightforward narrative, I want to go over some specific encounters and experiences I've had while playing to give you an idea of the kinds of horror we can encounter in the inhospitable world of the Long Dark. The first save I ever made on the Long Dark started off surprisingly well. I chose a fairly resource-rich place to start, and early on was feeling a little underwhelmed. It was fun, for sure, but survival hadn't been too difficult yet. I was promised a hardcore experience. When it became apparent that the abandoned little town I'd been staying in would eventually run out of supplies, I cautiously began making my way down the road to see what else was out there. Stepping out of my comfort zone, even with no clear sign of danger, aside from the freezing temperatures, of course, that confidence I had quickly began to dwindle, and the tension was starting to ratchet up. Every step took me further away from the safety of what I knew, and further into the unknown. Eventually, I found my way to a farmhouse. I settled in here for a little while, collecting resources, warming myself by the fire, and then the sound of a wolf howling in the distance. Immediately, the relief is gone, washed away by a wave of unease. And as I continued exploring and gathering resources, these distant wolf's cries also continued. For days it goes on like this, keeping me on edge constantly. Never close enough to warrant an immediate reaction, but close enough to remind me I am not safe. I never ran into that particular wolf, but knowing that it was always there, its voice haunting me through the wind, was a constant reminder. Do not get comfortable. In another save, one which I've spent far more time on, I had just finished spending the entire day scavenging around my semi-permanent base camp. Compared to the previous experience, I was far more seasoned, more hours of gameplay under my belt, and readily equipped with some lucky finds, including a rifle with one bullet. At this point, I had run into and escaped or driven off my fair share of wolves. I felt a level of confidence slowly returning, and then I see it. A bear. I try to duck behind this car as quickly as I can to avoid being seen, but I'm too late. It's making its way toward me. Now, I do have a rifle with me, but ammo is scarce and hard to find, and I've only got one bullet, and I'm not confident that's enough to take this thing down. Heart racing and the distance closing with each moment, I open the car door and duck inside. The bear comes all the way up to the window, and then leaves. I wait until the bear is out of sight, then make my way back to safety as quickly as I can. This moment was, all things considered, pretty brief, but it really stuck with me. Partially, that's due to my fascination with video games that can make very cinematic moments occur naturally. The whole experience of hiding inside a junk car, watching as the bear passes by was really filmic, but also because it captured so perfectly how the long dark can function as horror. In that moment, the game felt a lot more like frantically dashing inside a closet in Amnesia: The Dark Descent than it did a typical survival sandbox experience. Like I said, the game finds ways of stripping any of the confidence you may foolishly start to feel with these sudden moments of fight or flight. However powerful I feel with my gun in hand, loaded with gear, all it takes is one mistake, and nature will wipe you out. Settled fairly well into my base camp at this point, my attention was beginning to shift to more long-term planning. I felt like I had a grasp on the moment-to-moment goings-on and needed to figure out what my next objective was, which would likely involve a lot of exploration. Maybe the most fundamental factor in planning an expedition like this is setting out when you are fully rested. So I hit the hay, expecting to wake up with the sunlight beginning to cast through the windows. That's not where the light came from, though. I awoke to the buzzing of electricity and the lights. All of the lights were on. The computer on a nearby desk was on. Everything was flickering and surging. Remember, there isn't supposed to be any power in this game. Shocked and confused, I kid you not, my first thought was, I am being haunted. Or maybe abducted by aliens. Completely unsure of what to think, I step outside to find the sky aglow in green light, and every lamppost, every car, every radio on and blaring. Combine this with the game's stellar, eerie soundtrack, and needless to say, it was a wildly surreal experience. It took me a long while to snap back to reality and remember that I had heard something about this. Very vaguely, I remembered hearing about this kind of event in the game, auroras, an after effect of the geomagnetic storm. It brings to mind a more cosmic horror. We've talked a lot about the forces of nature as it relates to animals or weather, but it's easy to forget that for all Mother Earth can throw at us, our planet is still at the mercy of much larger forces. Celestial events which could, at a moment's notice, wipe out all power, or irrevocably change the weather, or swallow our entire planet or entire solar system. Though many of the anecdotes you'll find online which try to invoke this fear of gamma ray bursts or asteroids are often exaggerated in, at the very least, their likelihood of ever happening in our lifetime, there is something to that fear of the universe, a fear that is almost hard to quantify, as difficult to put into words as it is to comprehend the vastness of space. What the Long Dark does is place us in the practical aftermath of surviving such an event. And just like the universe, though it can be frightening, it can also lead to moments of beauty and awe. My absolute favorite moment experiencing an aurora came much later. From a vantage point high on a ridge near the coast, I saw a lighthouse. Noting that I'll definitely want to explore over there eventually, I went to bed and was awoken by yet another aurora. Coming back around to find that lighthouse now lit with flickering multicolored lights on the horizon was just one of the coolest things I've ever seen in a game. Previously, one of the very first items I found was a hunting knife, which I'm sure you can imagine was incredibly useful, and I figured was probably a really common item. In this save, however, I was not so lucky, and had been going on so long without a knife it was getting ridiculous. So I set out to follow one road and explore everything I could until I found one. That proved to be a long ways. I just kept pushing forward over icy lakes and collapsing rail bridges, its own moment of horror, let me tell you, assuming I would eventually find somewhere safe to stop. Then night fell, and temperatures began to drop rapidly. Wherever I had last seen an abandoned cabin or even car was too far away now. I'd be a frozen body before I could reach them. Instead, I had to spend the night in a tunnel. Hopefully enough shelter to avoid becoming a wolf pack's next meal, but not enough to combat the cold. I had to sleep in short shifts, waking up before I froze to keep the fire going. Despite the previous, perhaps more dramatic encounters I've detailed so far, this was the closest I've come to death on this save. I was out of resources. I had pushed myself too far, and the reality set in that I very well might not make it back. And it was one of the most tense experiences I've had playing the game. And this is exactly why I think The Long Dark may be the ultimate example of a game exploring the horrors of inhospitable environments. It's more than just a chance encounter with a hungry bear or wolf. It's the fact that you cannot even exist in this place. Without constant action and outside resources, you would succumb within hours, maybe minutes. Though the wildlife and precarious crossings pose a serious threat, the terror at the core of the experience is that it doesn't take you slipping down a cliff or falling victim to an animal. The environment itself is killing you at all times, battering you with wind, soaking you in water, and freezing you to the bone. There are some conditions which we simply were not built to exist in, and it is only by our careful and deliberate actions to defy this fact that we are able to survive. With all of that said, there is another running theme we've been discussing throughout this video, the interplay between the harsh winter weather and the coziness of the winter season, the comfort that comes in contrast to the bitter outdoors. And the long dork, big tall guy with goofy glasses, and The Long Dark, despite the anxiety and the struggle and the fear, has some of the coziest moments in gaming. When you've spent days barely scraping by with limited food, running low on supplies, and narrowly avoiding the jaws of hungry animals, there is nothing more relaxing and welcome than sitting by a fireplace in a cabin, heating up a can of dusty tomato soup, and drinking a hot cup of coffee. And that back and forth is what makes it work so well. The same kind of reprieve you get from entering a save room in Resident Evil. The exhalation before you must brave the terrors again. So, we've seen a wide variety of ways that horror games can explore the winter weather as a setting, and how they use this setting to augment or reinforce their main theme or core horror element. Whether that's the isolation of a winter forest as a parallel to personal feelings of isolation and numbness, the conflict between man and nature with an eldritch undertone, the cold and harsh world of the internet as portrayed through a frozen graveyard, nature's killer potential personified via a sadistic murderer with a meta twist, or the pure and unadulterated anxiety that comes with the reality of surviving in an inhospitable environment. The reason I think this thread of the setting and environment is noteworthy is because it demonstrates how important the setting is to the core of a story, especially in horror. For instance, at the center of John Carpenter's The Thing is the interpersonal distrust, how introducing this alien variable breaks the group's cohesion and trust in one another. Similarly, the films The Shining and Misery both have their own conflicts and hauntings and antagonists, but all of these films utilize their wintry setting to trap our characters or to increase the hopelessness of their situation, and ironically, to turn up the heat on the tension and anxiety. The use of the setting can inform the themes and direction of the story just as much as the characters can. All of that is to say that the setting is important. And working on this video through the winter, I couldn't help but notice all the ways that this time where the leaves have all fallen and snowflakes take their place informs its own unique brand of horror. It is one of my favorite times of year. I am an unapologetic super fan of the December holidays, but I think one of the reasons it can feel so special is because we're finding respite in the face of the bleak, the bitterness, the loneliness. It is only by this contrast that we feel so much luckier to be where we are, because without our loved ones and temperate homes and warm food, we would be alone and at the mercy of the inhospitable. Thank you all for watching. This video took way too long, so sorry for the wait. I was initially planning to release it for Christmas, so that gives you an idea of just how far behind I've been. But I'm really looking forward to this year. I've got so much great stuff in the works. And of course, a huge thank you to my patrons, one of whom actually recommended Winter Walk 2006. So thank you to Tom Purcell for recommending it. I hope your winter hasn't been too horrifying, and I will see you all next time. Fucking horror movie. I was just being silent for the noise reduction, but I was just